Justin Wallin is founder and CEO of Wallin Public Opinion Research, and he happens to be a good friend of decision makers. You can find out more about him at jwallin.com. And as always, good to have you, Justin.
Great to be here. Thanks for having me.
All right, excellent, excellent. So we have the midterms coming up, and so we're seeing quite a bit going on. And I did want to ask you, wanted to check in with you and see what's happening right now in the polling and public opinion space, your business. So is it, how, it always is business as usual, or are we saying anything new in terms of the trends?
Is anything business as usual in the age of Trump? I say that, and I think, the answer to that, which we both know, applies to this as well. I mean, some themes are carrying over from the last election, most notably, of course, affordability, which will define and determine the outcome of the midterms, much as it did for President Trump's reelection. But it's more almost kaleidoscopic than it was just a year and a half ago. Then affordability was just this kind of chunk of cost of living. And over time, the opinion research trade has really started to dig into it because it is a variety of different things. Obviously, costs, speaking the obvious, are the biggest component of that. An important aspect or cut to that is which costs, because it's a lot more than just costs. It's groceries, it's healthcare, it's transportation, it's utilities. It's all of these different things which are being compressed in a variety of different ways. And we have, I think, a recurring theme that administrations love to fall into the trap to. I don't know why it is so seductive, but we've seen it with every administration. This is not a Democratic problem. This is not a Republican problem. This is a guy or gal who leads our country and just can't see the forest for the trees, because they always say, but they use the stock market as a proxy for economic health. And when people are complaining about costs of living or their jobs or anything that's economic, when people are complaining about economic issues, they are not talking about the stock market. That is a totally different thing. And presidents at their peril and candidates for president at their peril talk about, confuse the two. And I think we're certainly seeing that at the top here. The president has been stubbornly incapable of recognizing the very real pain at the wallets of every household. And what's amazing about this, I released some research last week, and that was followed by some research that the Wall Street Journal did on affordability. And there is no safe harbor, right? You would think there would be safe harbor based on education level or maybe even party or geography. Or other demographics, the most obvious being income levels. Not true. Even those who are considerably more wealthy than most are feeling the pinch and feeling it in ways that affect their daily decisions. And this really, really matters. It's this suddenly, once this is felt by the affluent, and by no means am I suggesting the strain of the affluent in any way is comparative to the strain of those who are less fortunate. It isn't. But what it means is that it is now dinner table conversation for them. And that changes this narrative entirely. Take that and combine it with this other huge theme, which is distrust. Distrust of institutions, distrust of our institutional framework. This crosses all boundaries. This includes our education system, right? It includes our higher education system. It includes businesses, typically large businesses, which have never been viewed with high regard, right? When Americans say we love small business, they mean they love small business. Big business has always been viewed through the lens of distrust, but it is now any organization of meaningful size. And this absolutely 100% includes the government, whether that's the US government or state governments. This varies by state, or even, and this is really where it's getting odd and unusual, down to the municipal level. So this is a pretty volatile environment.
Yeah, it is. I did see that poll, by the way. We posted it at thebnote.com, and rather fascinating. Yeah, absolutely, anytime. Rather fascinating, remarkable data there showing. But and I just wanted to get this correct. Nearly half of Americans, and at least the respondents in your poll, indicating that they've skipped a meal. Is that
right?
And that's
skipped a meal. Now we kept that pretty broad. In the last several months, have you skipped a meal to save money? Breakfast, lunch, dinner. But the context matters. This is the richest country in the world.
right.
Right. And to skip a meal is dramatic. It's just huge. And for that higher proportion, and by the way, that proportion increased by some 20 points since when we last surveyed this in November. So not only is it huge, but it's accelerating rapidly.
Right. Right. And it's even the case for, as you said, the affluent, like the middle class, or being in the middle class category. It's no longer a permanent shield from that level of or hint of food insecurity, if you will. That's rather interesting. When I saw that. And so when we're talking, a lot of questions there, but got to keep kind of focused on right now the midterms, campaign fundraising. Hitting a lot of records this season, and so our candidates, and from your experience right now, what you're feeling, are candidates spending a lot of money on polling and voter research, trying to kind of get a gauge of how voters feel out there? Because you just outlined the key issues, the economic indicators that voters are worried about. So do candidates understand that? Are they looking at that kind of data and understand where they need to veer their campaigns?
They understand it in one sense. They know that it's the biggest issue.
Yeah.
But that's and to your point, is there more expenditure going on in terms of research? Yes, there is. It's two-faced though, and similar to how candidates are viewing the affordability issue. And the chasm that many fall into is that they understand affordability without doing research. They understand it's about costs of living. They understand it's about groceries. They understand it's about this and that. And what they fail to recognize is that this issue varies in its details by region dramatically. Mm-hmm. So how people are talking about it, what's affecting them directly. These things change in big ways. I mean, if you look in New York assembly districts, the election was yesterday. One of the biggest issues there throughout some of the assembly districts is circling Manhattan was disparity in expenditures on utility costs, on energy costs specifically. And while I don't think that actually won or broke any elections, it suddenly became part of the conversation. So that's an unusual thing for utility costs to spark up, but it's a very specific thing. And absent talking to people about what their pain points are, those candidates are going to miss it and ultimately run foul of the cardinal sin of politics, right? And what is that? Being genuine. So when you start talking about costs of living, you speak about it in generalities, it doesn't sound genuine. When you speak about a specific that doesn't actually key to what people are feeling, it sounds out of touch. So it's a road that's strewn with pitfalls, and good opinion research is necessary. We're seeing much more expenditure in terms of research in general, but this is bifurcated, maybe even trifurcated. Can we say trifurcated? Into these different spaces. One is approaching opinion research as a strategic asset that requires real investment. It's expensive, right? It costs real money. The other is there's a way to go at this that's cheaper and faster. And this tends to be largely influenced by your typical, basic consumer research goods, the things that you see in SurveyMonkey and things like that are online and easy to push out. The problem is the two are vastly different in terms of accuracy. One doesn't use the voter file, doesn't actually talk to the people who are voting. You're not ticking on those particular issues that are regionally specific or concepts that are regionally specific.
Yeah.
The difference between good opinion research and cheap and kind of cookie cutter opinion research is dramatic, and it has real effects because, of course, the rest of your strategy is based on that opinion research. So if it's faulty walking in, and you save $10,000 or $15,000, you really run a much greater risk, even an exponential risk, of failing, because you're going to be saying the wrong things to the wrong people at the wrong time, and suddenly, that credibility component is gone, and you can't get it back. Once credibility is gone, it's gone. So it's interesting. We're seeing more expenditure, some down the wrong paths, but ultimately people do recognize that in a highly competitive environment, they have to differentiate themselves. And having three guys and gals standing up and saying, I'm going to solve affordability, well, it simply doesn't pass muster, right? There's no differentiation there. And so I think, at least people recognize that, and they're trying to figure out a way to differentiate. That's a good start. That's good for America if they're digging into this.
Do you see this political season, as somewhat unique in the sense that there is this emphasis on issues that would be viewed once before as obscure, right? Data centers, like who thunk? How did data centers suddenly become a primary target or primary electoral target, right? You just said it a moment ago, rising energy prices, right? The price of a utility bill. These are issues that would not have made a headline in the past, but they're headliners now. Are you saying that as somewhat bizarre or weird, or just you saw that coming? You could predict, after a while, what, these are going to be top issues for voters.
Yeah, because they hit more, a typical development item, which ultimately data centers are, right? The typical development item, which we work on all the time, are hyper regionally. And they tend to have messaging points that are hyper regional, and they also tend to have players who understand that there is a give and a take in terms of what they're doing on a local basis. You want to build a large logistics center in Riverside? Well, you better be doing something for the local economy. You better be throwing $300 million into the city, building a new fire station, building out the freeway infrastructure, building a new school. You have to spend money to gain trust. This is reality. This is not cynical. This is money is one of those core components of value, right? And as human beings, we see that. Plus, you cannot be additionally in any way to their negative construct of how their life is. You cannot be adding to the costs of living. Their issues, I draw a distinction between things like big logistics centers, which are kind of thorny. The issues they always struggle with are pollution. Are we really going to add more pollution? More often than not, in some way, shape, or form, they are. And the argument usually is less than the other alternative for this land, right? That's usually the mitigating argument. With data centers, it's a whole different set of concerns. One is that voters perceive themselves to be subsidizing the costs of those data centers. So their increase in utility costs, right? That's very real. And since these data centers are being built at the same time that their increases are coming up, it's not hard to draw a parallel. I think that parallel is very well justified. There's more to it than that, but it's a very reasonable parallel. And the entities behind the data centers are doing a very poor job of illustrating the return for those residents. And it's much bigger, right? It touches much beyond that township. It touches the entire grid within a state more often than not. So the impacts are very real, and they're felt throughout a much larger space. Add to that, you have deep-seated concerns about what's actually being cooked in the factory, what's going on behind the curtain. Americans feel deeply suspicious of AI. And what we have here is all that and a confluence, and I work in tech, and this is a discussion. I think that I know you work in tech as well. I have clients in this space that we often have with our clients, and that is, not everyone thinks tech is as great as you think you are. In fact, it's quite the opposite. Right? The two most hated people in general now in America are, one, billionaires, and two, pretty much the same thing, tech bros. Americans just don't like them. It's not just that they distrust them, they viscerally don't like them. So when you have those companies coming in saying what we're doing is it's going to be better for you, they're not trusted. Period. End of discussion. No more story. And that now is feeding into elections. So it's a very interesting space.
But talk about all of this, if you will, Justin, that cost issue in the context of the war. Are Americans pretty much at the moment, pointing to the war as a primary factor in extracting money out of their pockets?
I think more and more so. So I don't think Americans as a whole are predominantly skeptical about the value of the stated goals of the war. Americans in general, to a large extent, do not want to see Iran with a nuclear weapon. Now, do Americans feel that the goals of that war were accomplished? Well, this is where things get fuzzy. And this is where Americans largely are not certain about this and have questions about this and have concerns about the amount of capital that was invested for what they see largely, and again, this is not everybody, but it's a large proportion, it's over a majority, of a result that's indeterminate. So either the results weren't delivered as stated, or, which I think is a very reasonable interpretation, or the administration has done a very poor job of communicating the actual results and how that ties back to intent. Also, which I think is a very fair a conclusion, or it just simply failed. Policy folks can get in and weed through this and say a lot of very positive things were done, including on the nuclear issue. They can also say quite the opposite. My point is that Americans are uncertain. They just don't see it. And that uncertainty combined to that massive amount of expenditure of capital, when they look and say, what could have been spent here within these borders? Yeah. Did we get a return on that investment? That's a big question. I think that's gonna play in. So in short, to your answer, does the war fall into that affordability discussion? Absolutely it does. Absolutely it does.
All right. So we're headed into we are now this year, the 250th anniversary of the birth of our nation, the beginning of the democratic experiment, right? And so how confident do Americans feel about that democratic experiment, like especially these past 2 years with the Trump administration, just basically balking at the branches, the three branches of power, and at the federal level, basically not listening to Congress, not taking direction from Congress, not taking direction from the Supreme Court. So obviously there's some issues there as far as trust in government to function through those checks and balances the way it's supposed to be, the way the Constitution lays out. So how is the American public right now viewing the democratic experiment as we're now in 250 years of our birthday?
I want to say something that might surprise you a bit. I think as this year continues, I think that more and more Americans are viewing that very positively. Mm-hmm. I think as the administration began on a very partisan basis and into increasingly independence, there was a great deal of fear about what the Trump administration was doing, which appeared to be in many cases unilateral. Of course, presidential power may appear to be unilateral, and presidential orders are something that have been used by all presidents. And President Obama was the king of presidential orders. If you look at things like retribution and those nasty little things, the Biden administration certainly was no stranger to this. I think both partisan sets of Americans had plenty to gripe about with the administration they didn't agree with, whatever that time was over the past 12 years. And the Trump administration started no differently, except what they included, which made this sense heightened and I think crept into the independent space, was velocity and violence. What we saw with the immigration issue, I think, was for most Americans, too much, too fast, and men with guns behaving violently towards either fellow Americans or towards those who, in the eyes of the American viewing public, pose no meaningful threat. For example, I think it's very difficult for Americans to swallow, and these aren't my words. These are the words that Americans use. I talk to people for a living, which means I listen to people for a living. It is hard for Americans to digest that an armed, trained man cannot sidestep a woman driving a car aggressively. Now, is she behaving poorly? Of course she is. Does she deserve to be shot? No. That's who we turn to our, those in power. We turn to them for that calm, cautious, strong approach. And strength often is in holding back. And over the past, really up until 3 months ago, that holding back, that calmness, the force of power wasn't very evident, right? It was quite the opposite. So I think we saw a lot of concerns around that. However, I think what Americans are starting to see now is our system working, which of course it does, right? The Supreme Court works extraordinarily well. And I think we're seeing that as, these items which have been going through the process. The problem with the American process, the problem with life and liberty and freedom of speech is it takes time, right? It's been described as messy, and it is messy. Things move to the court slowly, and what that means is people are hurt in the short term, right? Things that happen that will be reversed by the court, and not all things are reversed, but a lot of things have been and adjusted, have been, they've had real consequences for real people, whether they're Americans or immigrants or otherwise. That's a challenge in American society. But I think as things move through, at least at the Supreme Court angle, Americans are starting to see that this is a much more balanced approach and that there are very real checks and balances, and there are people who are unafraid of annoying President Trump. And Congress is a different matter. I mean, Americans view Congress as having largely abdicated their roles of responsibility pretty much since the end of World War II. And the easiest and most visible proxy of this is war, right? How many wars have we had since the conclusion of World War II? Well, we've had hundreds, right? And we just had another one that's called a war. And wars are supposed to be something that Congress has the purview of saying, do we go to war? The president can start action, but Congress has to approve it. Congress has to fund it. Congress has not done that ever since World War II, not in any of these things, right? They may have funded, but there's been no declaration of war that's signed by Congress. This is the congressional purview. They just shirk this stuff, and then they sit around and talk about how horrible it is that the president's doing X, Y, and Z. They did that against Obama. They did that against Trump. They did that against Bush. Biden, not so much because he wasn't terribly active, although with the closing of the wars, I think that could be fine too. I think Congress is the loser. Charles, I think Congress is the loser in Americans' eyes. I don't think Congress is viewed as an effective check and balance. I think that's to their discredit. I think that's going to affect them at the ballot box. And ultimately, I think that's going to be the question of, do we see this tremendous blue wave that everyone's anticipating? Or do people look at it and say, it just doesn't make that much of a difference, and I'm going to make a choice based on some other reason?
Don't want to dig further into this because you're right. That's a rather risky assessment, because many people would take exception with the assessment that you just made that Americans would be generally positive during our 250th. But a few things there. So I guess generally that's why, or historically that's why Congress flips. The majority party or the minority party takes over the Congress depending on who the president is. So Congress flips in terms of partisan dominance. It's because people are viewing Congress as the one that's fractured and dysfunctional, as opposed to the president. Is that what we're saying? So it's not just that we're seeing this now in the present. This is not an unusual thing. This is what's been happening for a long time. Is that your general point?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, there is always, and there always will be, with a president of overt overbearing personality, there's always going to be this person is at fault, period. But, the president doesn't own Congress, and Americans do recognize that. The president doesn't own the Supreme Court, regardless of what pundits may want to say and how, twist that and whatnot. Presidents just don't. When the Supreme Court was dominated by more liberal justices, Republicans like to say that, and they were full of beans then. And the people who say that this is dominated and run only by conservatives, they're full of beans now. It's just an ebb and flow to the Supreme Court. There's an ideological bent that goes back and forth. It's not owned by the president, no matter what president there might be. And the deliberative process works. It truly, truly works. And if we look at their decisions and the dissents and so forth, we can see that. And it's actually a wonderful thing. And I encourage Americans to do that, which, by the way, Americans are doing more and more of their own research these days. So I anticipate more and more of them will be doing that. But in terms of Congress and its disapproval, I mean, its approval ratings are very, very low. And I think that's for a reason. They're seen as really not doing a whole lot that's independent. And whether that's on the Democratic side or the Republican side, there's a whole lot of moaning about how horrible the other side is, but you're not seeing really what are the policies that are going to make my life better, right? That's what it comes down to. And I don't see that discussion. And more importantly, Americans don't see that discussion. Now, in terms of, how Americans view, America broadly, I mean, the numbers vary, but some 70% or so feel that America is largely doing the right thing and is a good player and these sorts of things. Would we want to see it at 80 or 90%? I guess so, but this is a democratic society. I mean, we're formed on dissent. We're out of the cauldron of fire, right? So anything that's over a super majority of people saying, hey, we're pretty much doing well as a free country, I think that's not bad. No, and you and I both know, by the way, I will say this, I do view the world, including the U.S., but not just the U.S., through somewhat rose-tinted glasses. But the process has been working. I think people see the process is working. It is messy, but there are instances. I mean, and you can't help but see them. I mean, the president's name was no longer on the Kennedy Center. Right. There's been significant knockdowns to presidential policy at the Supreme Court. That you can hear the president, if you want to look through his Truth Social stuff, it's not hard to find him railing and against the Supreme Court, calling them bad Americans and idiots and fools. That's not the posture of a man who's getting everything he wants, which I would say to those who are holding no kings rallies, choose better language. There are no kings in the United States. You may not like the president of the United States, but he was elected in a democratic process, just like the last president was. And those that say they aren't, including this president who said the last president wasn't, are full of it. Disregard them, have a laugh, tell them to relax, and let's talk about policy. Let's talk about what can be done that actually does improve each other's lives. Because this stuff, one, it doesn't work. Two, it's disingenuous. Three, no one believes it. And four, frankly, Americans are tired of it. Charles, I talk to so many Americans, I mean, throughout America, whether it's qualitative research or quantitative research, and I'm so encouraged because the drudgery of theory has seen its day in America. And no matter how strongly Americans may feel about something, what they're looking for is a context of discussion. They want to hear the other side. They don't want to hear yelling. They don't want to hear name calling. They want to hear a discussion. So-and-so says this is what's good about it. This is what I disagree about it. And that's what they're hoping for. That discourse doesn't exist now. The forum doesn't exist, but the appetite most certainly is.
Okay, talking about that satisfaction right now with how democratic institutions, protocols are functioning. Have you been able to assess it? Do you look at it broken down by demographics? So what's that look like in terms of income, in terms of region, community, race, gender?
Yeah, I mean, there are changes. Certainly, I think in general, for example, and this crosses just about every era. America fares fairly poorly among Black African American respondents in terms of trust and are things headed the right way institutionally. That's a topic of an entirely different discussion of which you have great depth of expertise and understanding, and I'd love to have that conversation. In terms of is America failing Are these institutions hated? Or is there no confidence, if you will? I think we'll borrow a term from the British on that. I don't think we're at the point of no confidence. I think we're at the point of deep distrust. Mm-hmm. And I think that distrust needs to be recognized. And I always, when I look at these things, they tend to kind of be couched in pundits, tend to be couched them in terms of conspiracy theories. Why do white men with guns distrust the government, or or maybe that same group of people saying, well, why do young black men distrust the police department? It's easy to put that into a conspiracy theory and apply a blanket kind of statement that washes it away. They think this, it's not true. They think this, let's just disregard it. I think that's the worst thing you can possibly do with your fellow man. There's usually a very good reason why people think what they think. It may not be a direct line, and it may not actually be true what they think. I'm not saying that it's not. I'm not suggesting that these reasons why people feel certain things are not true. What I'm suggesting is they're usually grounded in truth of some kind, and grounded in a very good reason to be distrustful. And I think we would do well to look at that. And I think as a society, part of that is pulling back, and I mean this on the institutional level, pulling back from the space of certainty. And that includes all aspects, whether it's a political ideology, whether it's science, whether it's religion, whether it's whatnot. It's okay to say, I think I'm right. Americans welcome that. You can have an opinion. It is not okay to say I'm right. Americans don't have much of an appetite for that, except for this small proportion of hyper-partisan folks who are really jumping up and down, and they're bought in. But they exist all the time. They're always there. They're this corner, this corner. They're the pugilists. The vast majority of America wants a discussion, and they're not convinced they're right. They're pretty sure of it, but they want to hear the other side. And they're open to hearing the other side, and they may remain unconvinced. But what doesn't convince them is someone telling them, I am right, and you not agreeing with me makes you take your choice of the smorgasbord. Stupid, uneducated, non-science, non-religious, not racist. You choose your term to throw at somebody. This is not working, and it's creating and reinforcing that deep distrust. As Americans, and I think more as institutions, because our institutions really began doing that, and our institutions have to stop that. If someone disagrees with an institution, you may tell me that they have to do it because it's the law. That's one thing, but you can't tell them that they are bad people for not agreeing with the law.
Hey, in terms of I got you for a little bit of time. In terms of the midterms coming up, messaging, right? So Democrats, however you want to perceive them, right now in Congress, they're the underdogs because of the minority. You might perceive Republicans as the underdogs because there's the expectation that they're going to lose their majority in the upcoming midterms because their president is in the White House, right? So what should the messaging be, you think? It's cost, but you mentioned already a few moments ago, get rid of brands like No Kings. So specifically, are you noticing, okay, if it's not No Kings, all right, what should it be? If, what should that message be? What's that key phrase that voters gravitate to as far as the Democrats are concerned? So because you have this struggle between establishment Democrats and, socialist Democrats, right? Or democratic socialists, as they're called, a young upstart generation that is making a big generational point. Then within the Republican Party, you've got a big struggle between centrist Republicans, moderates, established, old school Republicans, and extreme right, MAGA Republicans. So, and they've got some messaging issues of their own. So what is that overall attractive messaging for either one? Beyond cost. But I mean, if it were kind of broken down into one phrase or one or two phrases, what do you think that would be, Justin?
Well, two things. Just to reiterate, the primary messaging that works still works. It always has worked, and the pivot has to take place. So the truth is, if you looked at into the California gubernatorial race, which shifted dramatically, and you looked amongst what the top issue was for Democratic voters, the top issue was to fight against Trump in a California governor's race. So this thing of no kings, it works in a primary. So I don't want to pretend reality doesn't exist. And same thing for Republicans. It works in a primary. Saying someone's horrible or party's horrible works. Primary's over now. Now you got to win the general election. And you and I both know the general election messaging is very different.
Different beast.
Right. Different beast. And they have to shift into this space of do they actually understand the people they're talking to? And that's where it gets very difficult. And Democratic Socialists, for example, have a real challenge here because they have an assumptive approach to this, that their policies speak to those who are traditionally more progressive or traditionally more responsive to the progressive talking points. But progressive talking points and Democratic Socialist talking points are very different. When I poll in South Central Los Angeles, which is deeply Black, African American, working class, a lot of renters, and you ask about the appetite for removing Prop 13, which by no means is the majority of people there who are homeowners, that is met with massive opposition. When you talk about government subsidized housing, that is met with massive opposition. So the presumption on the part of the DSA is your typical academic arrogance, really, right? You should agree with me because this is good for you. It's very Soviet perspective, by the way. Forgive me for being honest about this, but you see the same thing in the Soviet societies, right? This is good for you, and once you,
sorry, no.
whether
I agree or not,
right. But we've seen this pattern before. This is going to be good for you, and we're going to push this in, and you'll be happy. Well, I mean, as it turns out, the Black community wasn't happy with government housing and name your urban environment, New York, Chicago, whatever, right? These experiments were tried, they failed. They created generational poverty and sadness, right? Family destruction and so forth. There's a lot of problems with this stuff. And also defunding the police, which is still an issue for Democratic Socialists. Try that on for size in East LA, a highly Latino, or try that on for size in South Central, highly Black African American. It doesn't fly. These are highly crime vulnerable communities, and they do have problems with the police. Don't suggest they don't, but they don't view them as a monolithic block of evil, of an evil force. They view the world in a much more nuanced way. So the question here is what
they're practical about it. It's like, but they also have challenges, public safety challenges, and they're like, well, we still need that layer of protection. So yeah.
And that's exactly it. It's the practicality, it's the pragmatic nature of it. So once people comes in with dogma, whether they're dogma on the right or dogma on the left, the people who are listening realize this is not credible. These people are not going to help me. And it reinforces the suspicion. And I know it's hackneyed to say that candidates are going to have to connect, but connecting is different than I feel your pain. It's actually speaking about this pain in a way that means they've lived it and they understand it, and that you can't just leave it there. You have to have a solution that makes some sense of credible sense. People are done with the free everything. I know folks are looking at the Mamdani race and saying, yeah, he promised to give out free stuff and that's why he won. That's a very simplistic way to look at why Mamdani won. It's not fair. Mamdani won because he identified real pain points and he spoke about them, aside from the fact that there are other confluences, right? I mean, it was a field of very poor candidates. Mamdani excelled in this space, and hats off to him. He spoke about this pain and he had solutions. And by the way, not if you talk to folks, people weren't like, hey, I believe this solution is going to work. It was a much more subtle thing. It was, nothing else has really worked that great. And at least he has a vision. So when you think about that for a moment as a candidate, what extraordinary opportunity is that for you? Vision. So many candidates don't have it. And they're just, they fall flat. They sound disingenuous. They sound uninspired. And we end up with candidates whose actual policy positions may be a direct contradistinction to the hopes and desires and perspectives of those that they hope to represent. And yet, just solely because they have vision and in their field of folks who don't and are poor candidates, they're going to rise to the top.
Hey, Justin, last question, because we focus a lot on Democrats here, but what about Republicans? So, Democrats viewed as creating things that fail, based on what you're saying, your analysis. Republicans perceived as those who take away things, that Social Security, Medicaid, other things, SNAP, WIC, things that are, it's not just for sort of those assumed demographic groups like, Blacks or Latinos. Majority of people who use like a food stamp program are white people. So like white rural Appalachian folks. But like Republicans typically viewed as those cracking certain critical institutions or agencies or programs. So I mean, how are people viewing that? And as they're heading into the midterm, I mean, is that view hurting them? Also, is President Trump, who's also viewed in some negative ways, is he really a liability as we're expecting?
I think in general, he is a liability. I also think that these cost issues are a liability, and I think you're absolutely right. Let's juxtapose it with the cost-cutting approaches of Clinton, with the cost-cutting approaches of Gingrich. Gingrich was less, cozy and cuddly than Clinton, but his arguments were very similar, right? His arguments were, we have to reduce costs. So we're going to reduce costs and I'm speaking broadly, I know this is imperfect, but very similar to Clinton's. We're going to look at those spaces where people really could be more productive part of our society. And they should be. They should be not just for the rest of society, but they should be for themselves because it's good for them as human beings, right? And we care about them as human beings. That has never been stated, as far as I know, in all of this. It's been waste, fraud, and abuse. It's been, we have to cut because there's too many people, slacking off or whatever the term they want to use. And there's been no acknowledgement that for the most part, people are within some kind of a system because of a situation of pain. Does it mean that they should be there in perpetuity? Well, it's a different question, right? And every single person requires a very specific, careful look at their particular situation. That lens of looking at every situation hasn't existed. Programs were cut broadly. Programs were cut without really any care and consideration for kind of where the most opportune spaces were. Opportune to them meant where there were the biggest savings, right? Where was what they felt was likely fraud. And yes, there's fraud. We see that. We see it in the papers every day. There's no question there's fraud. There's the biggest opportunity is in moving people out of these programs into less reliance on those programs or no reliance on those programs. And usually that doesn't happen successfully by simply cutting them off. Every one of those successful programs, including Clinton, including Gingrich, had a transitional component, which involved government in some way, right? Local government organizations, so forth, ways to move people on to a more successful space in life, successful for them, successful for society. We're missing that here. This goes on beyond, and I think the biggest thing that it connects, and we all know folks who have been hit by the cuts to SNAP and Medicaid and all these kinds of things, right? We do, like all of us know or have family members who have experienced those cuts. But the big broad thing that we all know that is even bigger than that, I think perceptually, is healthcare. Everyone's premiums have gone up; they've skyrocketed. Meanwhile, they're what is actually covered has collapsed or it's non-existent. So the value there has gone away, and there's no solution. There's no empathy of you might want to stay alive for a while, or have good prenatal care, or you might want to live a good life. And I think our politicians are failing to do two things. One, America is not about surviving. It's not what America is about. That's not why people love America. That's not why we have this wonderful immigration problem. And I say that with very specific terms. Wonderful immigration problem. The immigration may need to be carefully regulated. I understand that. But the fact that people want to come here en masse is a beautiful problem. We don't have it because people just get by in America. We have it because people can succeed in a way that is better than their parents did. and we can all be aspirational. I know this sounds like a big speech, but isn't that it? When did we just start being satisfied with it's good enough? We never should have. We never, the fact that Americans, a large chunk of Americans have just stopped hoping to own a home, that's not right. That's not American. These things should change. And politicians aren't talking about that. And when they're talking about our problems, when they're talking about healthcare, they're not saying anything other than it just costs too much. What's missing about that? It should be better. We should have excellent healthcare. We should have amazing healthcare. We should have better healthcare than anywhere else in the world. And not only that, it should cost less, right? That's why people bought Fords. Better cars cost less. And America was able to make that stuff. When did we stop? When was good enough good enough? And now we're at the point of, now we're just lying. And Americans know it. I mean, it's the old joke of the Soviet worker, not to go back to the Soviets again, but I mean, there's so much, you know, it's what is the Soviet, auto worker? What was their relationship to the Soviet state? Well, they pretend to pay us and we pretend to work. We're sliding pretty close to that, aren't we? I mean, if we're paying vast amounts of money for things that don't give us vast amounts of return, where does that lead us as American people? What is it about that gets people to jump out of bed and do creative things and amazing things and do better than they thought they could in the face of the daily adversity that we always hit? I think our politicians are missing that. They keep talking about, we're going to fix costs, we're going to fix this. So yes, that's the symptom, but that's not what Americans are looking for.
Interesting. All right. Thanks for your time as always, Justin. By the way, my late father would crash his Chevy into your Ford.
As he should. I happen to like.
He was a big Chevy. He was a big Chevy dude. Yeah, and he's like, don't buy a Ford. Always go Chevy. I was like, okay, Dad. So
I empathize with that very much.
Yeah. So I was like, okay, I will never buy a Ford. I got you. So that is this episode of Decision Makers. I'm Charles Ellison, your executive producer and host. Warm round of gratitude to our partner, always the Civic Literacy and Media Influence Institute at Learn for Life, always making this possible. You can find this episode and more while you subscribe at thebnote.com. Thanks again for watching. And in the meantime, stay safe out there, please.